Welcome back. We're about to begin a deep dive we're calling Reformed Thinking, and today we are looking at a theological debate that really gets to the heart of everything. It's about status versus condition.
It is. We've compiled some source materials here that center on a really sharp discussion about a few key New Testament passages. We're talking Romans 5 and Ephesians 2.
And the main players in this debate are the theologian Jonathan Edwards and a commentator we know as Dr. T. We're going to be dissecting how they understood Paul's pronouns, his terminology.
That's right. And our mission really is to see how these two different ways of reading the text completely alter our view of human sinfulness and, the actual reach of the gospel.
So the whole discussion really hangs on this one question. When the Apostle Paul uses language like sinners or children of wrath, is he describing the universal inherent state of all people?
Which is the view Edwards takes.
Right. Or are these just restricted labels, words that apply only to the Gentiles because of their customs and their lack of a covenant relationship with God?
And that's Dr. T's view. And these two interpretations set up completely different theological systems. I mean, if sin is universal, if it's innate from birth, then salvation has to be from sovereign grace alone.
But if it's restricted to just certain groups, and it's something you acquire through habit,
then the whole nature of grace changes. Its necessity changes.
Right.
We're basically defining the cure by defining the disease.
Okay, this is a huge topic, so let's try to unpack it. I think we have to start by appreciating just how radical Dr. T's position really is. We should begin with his assertion about Paul's language in Romans 5.
Yeah. He argues it's not a general condemnation of all humanity. He says it's much more specific. It's a cultural and religious designation.
So Dr. T is arguing for what he calls a severely restricted scope when you're reading Romans 5, verses 6 to 10. He makes the claim that Paul is speaking, and I'm quoting here, only of the Gentiles in their heathen state.
Which is just a massive interpretive move.
It is. Because it means the test isn't about the moral or personal condition of an individual. It's all focused on the miserable state of that great collective body, the heathen world.
Right, which immediately makes you ask the question, why? Why would Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, be emphasizing the miserable state of the heathen world in a way that seems to let the Jewish people off the hook?
And Dr. T has an answer for that.
He does. It's an ingenious answer, even if we find it flawed. He tries to turn these deep theological descriptions into, technical status labels.
So when Paul uses these really powerful words in Romans 5, sinners, ungodly, enemies, Dr. T says these are not descriptions of moral character that everyone shares.
No, he claims they're technical titles, words that were adopted from centuries of Jewish custom.
You have to remember the whole socio-cultural backdrop of the first century.
Yeah.
The Jewish people defined themselves by their covenant, by the law, their lineage. So for an observant Jew, the rest of the world, the nations, the goyim, they were defined by what they didn't have.
They lacked the law, the covenants, the temple, all of it.
So these labels, sinner, ungodly, they just function as distinguishing marks for the outsiders.
Precisely. Dr. T says that the Jews use these names not just casually, but to dignify and distinguish the heathen world in opposition to the Jews.
Think about what a word like ungodly meant in that context.
Yeah. To a Jew, the godly person was the one who kept the covenant. So if you didn't, you were, by definition of your status, ungodly.
So if we follow this logic, being a sinner doesn't mean you've broken God's law in your heart. It just means you don't have Jewish covenant privileges. You're part of the unclean nations, not one of God's special favorites.
And that status distinction over time became a marker of real contempt. It was a way of verbally walling off the world. Dr. T is arguing that Paul, writing to this mixed church of Jews and Gentiles, just temporarily adopts this old Jewish way of speaking.
So he's using their own language to refer only to the Gentile members of the church.
Yeah, to draw a contrast with the Jewish members. So in Dr. T's view, the word sinner is basically a status label. It means non-Jew. It's like a legal classification, not a comment on your heart condition.
He has an analogy for this, doesn't he?
He does. He says to imagine a diplomat. If a diplomat uses the word foreigners, he's not making a moral judgment.
No, he's just stating their national designation. It's a status label.
Or a soldier using the term civilian. It's the same idea. For Dr. T, sinner is just the historical way Jews talked about everyone else. It's a status.
Okay, but this view runs into a really big problem, a really challenging phrase in Romans 5, where Paul says, while we were yet sinners. If sinner is a Gentile status label, how does Paul, a Jew of Jews, include himself?
Dr. T has a way around this too. He argues that Paul is using we purely in a representative capacity,
Meaning?
meaning Paul says we because he's the apostle of the Gentiles. He's speaking for them, not as one of them.
Oh, I see. Like a lawyer speaking on behalf of his clients.
That's the idea. If an attorney stands up and says, "We are pleading not guilty," he's using we because he represents the group. He's not on trial himself.
So Dr. T is saying Paul says we sinners because he's their advocate, their spiritual guide, not because he actually shares the status of being from the heathen world.
And this is so critical for his argument because it lets him keep the Jewish people and Paul himself on a different moral footing. They're constitutionally superior to the Gentiles.
Okay, so that sets up this clean division. Jew equals covenant person, Gentile equals sinner status. But then you have to deal with Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3.
The big one.
Yeah, which has the phrase that makes this division so much harder to hold on to, by nature, children of wrath. That sounds way too strong to be just a status label.
It is. And it forces Dr. T to redefine the word nature itself. He can't accept that Paul means nature in the sense of origin or birth.
Because that would apply to Jews just as much as Gentiles. Everyone is born.
Right. So he offers two other ways to understand by nature, or physis in the Greek.
What's the first one?
His first interpretation is that by nature is just a metaphorical expression. It means nothing more than truly or really children of wrath. It's just for emphasis.
So it's a qualifier, like saying they are genuinely children of wrath.
Correct. Dr. T says the term is borrowed from common speech, like when you distinguish a true and genuine child of a family from, say, an adopted one. So in his view, calling them children of wrath by nature is just emphasizing the reality of their bad situation, not the origin point of it.
So they really are condemned, but that condemnation didn't start at birth.
That's the argument. He even uses the parallel of Paul calling Timothy his own son in the faith, arguing that by nature just functions in a similar way to signal genuineness.
But even if it means truly, that still implies a pretty fundamental state. His second interpretation seems to go further, and it attacks the source of the problem by denying innate corruption altogether.
It does. To get around the idea of depravity originating at birth, Dr. T argues that nature can also mean a habit contracted by custom, an acquired nature.
So by this definition, people weren't born corrupt.
No. They became children of wrath through long practice, through cultural conditioning. They were, you could say, naturalized into sin through habit.
This shifts the blame from our inherent human makeup and puts it squarely on our environment and, prolonged bad choices. If you live among the heathen, you acquire a heathen nature.
Exactly. The idea here is what we call second nature. The source materials give a great analogy for this. Think of a really skilled pianist.
Okay.
If you say he's a pianist by nature, Dr. T would say that's just a figure of speech. It means he's a truly great pianist, or that playing has become second nature to him through years and years of practice.
He wasn't born with the talent. He acquired it so thoroughly that now you can call him a genuine musician.
Yes. And that interpretation allows Dr. T to keep the corruption restricted to the Gentiles. He can attribute their sinfulness to the bad, long-standing customs of their heathen state, and he avoids the implication that all humanity, Jews included, starts life under God's wrath.
It's a very sophisticated argument.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to manage these difficult texts by changing the definitions of Paul's key words. Status instead of moral condition, acquired habit instead of birth origin.
It's a complete system.
Okay, so now let's turn to Jonathan Edwards, because he treats this argument not just as, a minor disagreement, but as a serious threat to the gospel itself.
He really does.
Edwards challenges this restricted scope head on. He argues that Dr. T's interpretation would force Paul to rebuild the very partition wall that the gospel was meant to abolish.
And that's the highest theological stake you can have. The whole point of the gospel is reconciling Jews and Gentiles into one new man. If Paul is just adopting these Jewish terms of contempt, these labels like sinner, he's actually validating that self-exalting spirit that Christ's work was supposed to destroy.
Right. If the Jew thinks he only needed a little reformation, but the Gentile needed a whole new creation, they can't really stand equally at the foot of the cross.
No, they can't. And Edwards just zeroes in on Dr. T's central maneuver, this claim that Paul uses we representatively because he's the apostle of the Gentiles. Edwards sees that as logically absurd and almost psychologically dishonest.
He gives some really sharp analogies to show how illogical it is.
He does. Think about the physician analogy. A doctor, when he's talking to his patients about their sickness, doesn't lump himself in with them. It would be ridiculous for a doctor, while explaining the cure he's providing, to say, "we sick folks."
Of course not. He doesn't share their condition, so he can't use the collective pronoun sincerely.
Exactly. Or, his other analogy, a father speaking about the benefits he gives his children, he'd never say, "we children." Edwards argues that Paul's role as an apostle, as their spiritual guide, is meant to elevate him out of that state of heathenism, not reduce him to it. So for him to say, "we sinners," it has to mean he genuinely believes he shares that exact same condition.
The source material gives an even stronger example, the missionary absurdity.
Yeah. If a Christian missionary went to a country full of deists trying to convert them, it would be unnatural and absurd for him to say, "we foolish blind infidels," unless he genuinely believed he was one of them, or at least that he used to be one of them before his conversion. Paul's job isn't just to represent the Gentiles, it's to deliver them from their state as sinners. His self-inclusion is deeply contradictory if he didn't share their core moral condition. He's identifying with the disease, not just the patients.
It really highlights the difference between a functional role and a shared state. Dr. T sees Paul as a defense attorney, using "we" as a legal formality, but Edward sees Paul more like a recovering alcoholic leading a support group.
That analogy is perfect for understanding Edwards' point. When the leader of a support group stands up and says, "we are all addicts," he's not just being polite. He's not speaking rhetorically.
No, it's a radical admission.
It is. He's saying that despite his leadership role, he shares the exact same disease and needs the exact same recovery as everyone else in that circle. Paul has to confess that he shares the inherent universal depravity of the very people he's serving.
So after dismantling the logic, Edwards then shifts to pure grammar. He presents what he sees as the absolute proof in Ephesians 2.13, showing that Paul deliberately distinguishes between Gentiles and himself before lumping them all back together.
This is where Edwards really shows Paul's mastery. He analyzes Paul's sentence structure so carefully. Paul starts by addressing the Ephesians, who were Gentiles, and he uses the second person plural. "You walked according to the course of this world." That establishes the Gentiles' condition.
He sets up the ye, and then comes the big pivot in verse 3.
A huge pivot. Paul deliberately switches the pronoun. He steps away from the second person and includes himself and all the other Jewish believers, among whom we also had our conversation. The "we" is just undeniable. It forces the Jewish reader, who maybe felt superior to the "ye," to now stand right alongside them.
But the real nail in the coffin for Dr. T's view is the phrase that completes that thought. Paul says, "We also were by nature children of wrath, even as others." What is the force of that final phrase?
That phrase, "even as others," just destroys the Gentile-only claim. Edwards argues that others refers directly back to the Gentiles he just addressed as ye. So if "we" also just meant Gentiles, like Dr. T claims, the sentence would be nonsense. It would say, "We Gentiles were children of wrath, even as other Gentiles."
It's redundant. The comparison collapses.
It collapses completely. The sentence only makes sense if "we" refers to the Jews who are now being equated with the others, the very Gentiles they look down on.
So Paul is establishing universal depravity. The chosen people, the "we," shared the exact same condition as the unchosen nations, the others.
Yes, and it gets stronger. Paul actually says "we all," which dismantles any idea that the Jews were exempt because of their covenant status or their birth. This use of "we" is an act of theological demolition. He's tearing down Pharisaical pride with grammar.
And to really drive this point home, Edwards points out a consistent pattern in all of Paul's writing. When Paul is genuinely talking about Gentile status or their cultural distinctions, he never includes himself. He never uses "we."
This is such a great observation by Edwards. When Paul really does want to talk about national or cultural differences, he goes back to the second or third person. Look at Ephesians 2.11. Paul says, "Remember that ye being in time past Gentiles in the flesh."
He doesn't say, "Remember that we being in time past Gentiles."
Never. Paul consistently uses "ye" for Gentiles when he's talking about their national identity or circumcision status. But he only uses "we" when he's talking about the universal moral condition of sin that needs redemption. This proves that "we" describes a state Paul genuinely shared, not just a title he adopted for his job.
So Paul is grammatically separating the status Gentile versus Jew from the condition sinner versus righteous. And when it comes to the spiritual condition, that dividing line just dissolves. They're all "we."
That's it, exactly. The gospel is about moral reality, not national labels. Paul is showing that before Christ, a Jew's heart condition was identical to a Gentile's, and that just eliminates any and all ground for boasting.
So having dismantled Dr. T's use of "we," Edward still has to deal with that one word. Dr. T tried so hard to redefine nature. Dr. T wanted physis to mean acquired custom, or just truly. So Edwards has to go from grammar to linguistics to show that Paul's word choice demands an interpretation connected to birth.
And this section of the argument really shows you the depth of Edwards' scholarship. It shows why these tiny Greek details matter so much. Dr. T tried to separate physis from its core meaning of origin. Edwards just goes back to the etymological root of the word to show how weak that argument is.
Okay, so let's break down the etymology of physis.
The Greek word for nature, physis, comes from a root verb, phio. And what does phio mean? It means things like to beget, to bring forth young, or even to bud forth, like a plant producing new growth. It's a very active, generative kind of verb.
That makes the meaning of by nature much more specific than what Dr. T was allowing.
It does. Edwards argues forcefully that the phrase by nature has to signify what a person is by birth or natural generation. The concept baked into the word itself is one of an origin story. It implies that this state of being a child of wrath began at the very source of our existence. It's a biological claim, not just a cultural one.
And this emphasis on origin and generation isn't just in that one word. Edwards points out that Paul reinforces this idea by his careful choice of the word for children in the very same verse.
This is a brilliant technical observation. In Ephesians 2, verse 2, when Paul is talking about the children of disobedience, he uses a common Greek word, huioi. And huioi can refer to legal associations, adopted relationships, or even just people who follow a certain custom like sons of the city.
But then when Paul shifts to describing the universal condition that Jews and Gentiles share, children of wrath, he switches the word.
He switches. In verse 3, he deliberately uses the word tekna. And you have to ask, why change the term? Well, tekna comes from the verb tikto, which means to bring forth children or to beget.
So tekna has a much stronger biological connection than huioi.
Much stronger. Edwards argues that tekna more properly signifies a begotten or born child. So by putting tekna right next to physis, Paul is creating this sort of linguistic echo chamber. It powerfully reinforces this idea of a congenital condition.
It makes Dr. T's interpretation of acquired habit seem really forced.
It seems, as Edward says, unnatural and unreasonable, because the very words Paul chose point directly to the state we're in when we are brought forth, when we are born.
That level of linguistic precision is just incredible. Paul could have just kept using huioi if he only meant people who are characterized by wrath. But by switching to tekna, he's pointing to birth itself as the source of the problem.
Yeah, think about it. If sin was just a cultural habit, why would you use a word that emphasizes being a begotten child of wrath? It doesn't really fit. But if sin is innate, if it's original sin corrupting our nature from conception, then tekna and physis are the most precise theological terms you could possibly use.
And this also serves to refute Dr. T's other claim that by nature was just a metaphor, like Paul calling Timothy his own son.
Correct. As Edwards points out, even the word used there for own son, nesios, is derived from words referring to offspring or begetting genos. So whether you're talking about natural generation or spiritual regeneration, the terms all imply an origin story, a definite source point, not a status you acquire later.
And the final linguistic proof Edwards offers, which might be the most compelling, is the direct contrast Paul makes in the structure of the sentence. He sets up a theological opposition.
Yes, the contrast with grace is the key that unlocks the whole meaning of the passage. The text sets what they were by nature in direct opposition to what they are by grace. Edwards argues that if by nature just meant truly, or really, as Dr. T suggested, there's no logical opposition there. The tension in the verse just disappears.
You could be truly in a state of salvation. It doesn't work as a contrast.
It doesn't. But because by nature means by birth, the opposition is absolute. Birth brings condemnation. Salvation can only come through an external divine grace.
It's a zero-sum game. What you get naturally leads to destruction. What you get supernaturally leads to life.
And that structure confirms that any goodness in a redeemed person is wholly from divine grace. It is entirely God's workmanship. This is essential theology, and it's built right out of the grammar and the etymology of the text.
But Paul is defining human nature itself as a corrupt starting point that is the opposite of grace. And this sets the stage for the massive theological stakes that are involved here.
It really does.
The debate we've just walked through over pronouns and Greek roots, it's not just academic hair-splitting. It defines whether Christianity is a system for spiritual self-improvement or if it's a necessary radical resurrection.
That's right. If Dr. T is right, then redemption is about curing a social problem or fixing bad cultural conditioning. But if Edwards is right, redemption is something far, far more sweeping.
It really is a matter of spiritual life and death. Let's go back to the broader theological purpose that Edwards argues Dr. T's view completely undermines: the gospel's goal of dismantling that partition wall.
That wall was everything. The Jewish people based their identity and a lot of their pride on their privileges. Their lineage from Abraham, having the law, circumcision. These things created a cultural and linguistic wall.
And it fueled their disdainful language for Gentiles, calling them sinners or dogs.
And that created this self-distinguishing, self-exalting spirit. If Dr. T were correct and Paul was just adopting these Jewish status labels, then Paul would be endorsing that very pride and contempt. But the whole New Testament project, especially in Romans and Ephesians, is designed to destroy the idea that one group has a moral or spiritual head start over another.
Paul proved that the Jews were by no means better than the Gentiles, as he says in Romans 3:9. He established that there was no difference in their fundamental need for salvation.
And the inclusion of the Jew, that's the theological crowbar he uses to pry open the universality of original sin. Edward says that even those who were Jews by nature, the supposed special favorites of God, were still by nature children of wrath, even as others. That one declaration just strips away any claim to superiority based on your birthright or your rituals.
This also means that the very privileges the Jews boasted in, like having the law, it didn't save them from condemnation. It actually made it worse.
Absolutely. Paul's argument was that the law didn't make them less sinful. It gave them the standard that measured their innate corruption. And because of that, it condemned them and made them sinners in a higher degree. The whole purpose of Paul's self-inclusion, the we also, was to crush that Pharisaical self-righteousness that lets one group look at another and say, stand by yourself, I'm holier than you.
And that required admitting that the source of the disease, the corrupt nature, was shared by everyone.
Yes, and this inherent state of sinfulness, being by nature children of wrath, connects directly to the doctrine of total depravity.
If the corruption is innate, then our human nature lacks anything good that could earn salvation.
And that is the critical point Edwards is defending. The human will cannot, on its own, generate good works or faith from its natural state. If Dr. T's view is right, and sin was just an acquired habit, then all humanity would need is better cultural norms or better parenting or maybe some self-improvement programs.
We could contribute to our own rescue.
We could, but the power of Edwards' analysis is that he shows Paul himself gives us the strongest metaphor against that view, the metaphor of death. Paul explicitly connects this state to being dead in trespasses and sins.
And you don't ask a corpse to help with its own revival.
You don't. The text compares salvation to a new creation or a resurrection from the dead. Ephesians 2:1 says, "You hath he quickened who are dead in trespasses and sins." That metaphor confirms that humans are destitute of spiritual life. We're like a corpse. If righteousness were natural to us, we wouldn't need such a radical, life-giving new birth.
Which means that salvation can't be a refinement of our original nature. It has to be a replacement.
It has to be a total ontological shift. It's the work of a creator, not a therapist. Edwards clarifies that because we are children of wrath by nature, salvation must be entirely the workmanship and the gift of God. Even faith itself is a gift, so that, as Paul says, no man should boast.
This distinction is what makes this whole argument so foundational for Reformed theology. It demands humility and universal union, because we all stand equally dependent on Christ. Dr. T's argument, on the other hand, risks bringing human merit and cultural superiority right back in the door.
Think about it. If the Jew was only a sinner by cultural association, as Dr. T would have it, then maybe he was only slightly fallen. Maybe he required less of an intervention than the totally heathen Gentile. But if they were by nature children of wrath, as Edwards argues, then their Jewish heritage saved them from 0 degrees of condemnation.
It's a profound leveling effect.
It is, and it ensures that grace remains sovereign and completely unearned. That's the real difference between these two ways of reading the text. Is our rescue a partial improvement or a total recreation?
And the ultimate application of all this linguistic rigor from Edwards is to elevate divine grace to the necessary level. Only a catastrophic condition requires a catastrophic, miraculous cure.
And Paul's very precise use of techna and physis ensures that we understand that the catastrophe began right at the origin point of our human existence.
So this deep dive has shown us how just paying close attention to 2 words, a pronoun and a noun, can shift the entire map of redemption. We saw Dr. T's view, which tried to restrict sinners to a Gentile status label and define nature as just an acquired habit.
And then we saw Edwards's comprehensive refutation. He used Paul's grammatical shift from addressing you to including we also to prove universal depravity. And then he used the specific Greek terms for nature, physis, and children, techna, to confirm that this condition is innate, it's congenital, it goes back to our birth.
The significance of this is just immense. By listening carefully to the apostles' exact language, we move redemption from being a cure for a social problem to being a resurrection from a fatal inborn spiritual state. It defines what we contribute to our salvation, which is nothing, and what God contributes, which is everything.
The whole dispute was really about whether sin is a matter of your social location or a matter of your genetic origin. And Edwards showed that the gospel, by defining sin as a universal nature, completely levels all human pride. And that paves the way for unconditional grace.
And that leaves us with a necessary thought for you to consider. If the gospel is designed to abolish pride and to create one new man out of two warring groups, think about how maintaining any modern linguistic separation between us, the redeemed or the morally upright, and them, the ungodly, the culturally lost, can inadvertently start rebuilding the very same partition wall that Paul worked so hard to tear down.
The reality that we were by nature children of wrath, even as others, should always govern how we interact with the world around us.
Until the next deep dive, keep thinking.